Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review or just tell a friend. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 143 with Gail Aldwin talking about her children's picture book, Pandemonium, but also her new novel which comes out next year, as well as telling me about her long journey to publication and why she likes to write short stories alongside a novel. Before that, I'll tell you what I've been up to. In the last episode I mentioned I'd attended the online version of my old critique group, Phoenix Writers. Well, since then I've returned again writing a new piece of flash fiction for my homework, so it's good to actually get some new words down, but also reading a revised short story that I'm in the process of submitting to competitions. It's something I wrote a few years ago, and like most work, it really benefited from me revisiting it with a fresh pair of eyes. It's kind of a dark little crime story told in first person from the perspective of an abused man that returns to the house of his abuser. It's got an unusual twist, and I was a bit worried that it might be a bit outlandish, too much of an outlandish conceit to rest the story on, but I was pleased to hear the group had got no qualms about that at all. But what I did realise was that there are a few places in the story where the voice of my protagonist is inconsistent in terms of the language I've used and the things he does and doesn't notice. But overall, it's a case of a minor re-edit, and I'll be getting the story back out into the world to see if I can get any competition success with it. I'll keep you posted. Aside from the day job, the rest of my time has been taken up with the imminent release of an album of songs I'm releasing with my long-time musical collaborator, George Odom. We go by the name of the Rye Dogs, and despite having been writing and recording stuff together for about 25 years, this will actually be our first widely released full album of material. The album's called Are You Even Listening and should be out across all major streaming platforms and CD by December 21st. There are 12 songs on it, and I'll give you another sneak preview at the end of today's show if you're still interested. I'm considering a one-off episode dedicated to the album and giving some insight into how I write songs, because it occurs to me that I've had lots of different kinds of writers on the show, including playwrights, poets, screenwriters, graphic novelists, and as of today, a children's picture book author, but never really covered songwriting. I'm considering breaking down some of the tracks on the album, playing a few clips, sharing some lyrics, and maybe even one or two early demo versions to show you the process from start to finish. Does that sound like something you'd be interested in, or is it just too far removed from the usual format? I was thinking about it, just a little special pre-Christmas episode. But let me know, because the last thing I want to do is annoy you, and in any case, I always love to hear from you about your projects, your thoughts on the show in general, or if you've got any suggestions for future guests. So get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellyWrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk. It's totally free, and you get a couple of downloadable goodies when you sign up, and you'll be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, enough about me. Let's get to the real reason you tuned in today, the interview with Gail Aldwin. So based in Dorset, Gail writes fiction and poetry. Her short fiction collection, Paisley Shirt, was longlisted in the Best Short Story category of the Saboteur Awards 2018. Her debut novel, The String Games, was published by Victorina Press and was voted a finalist in the People's Book Prize 2020, as well as being shortlisted in the Dorchester Literary Festival Writing Prize 2020. For her latest project, Gail has turned her attention to writing for children, with her new picture book, Pandemonium, out just in time for Christmas. So let's just say we had a lot to talk about. So enjoy the chat, and I'll be back at the end to give you a sneak preview of the new album too. Okay, Gail, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. Really appreciate it. So why don't you just start off just by giving us a sense of where you're speaking from and how things are going at the minute?
Well, I live in Dorset, and I'm very lucky that I've got a writing room that overlooks water meadows on the outskirts of Dorchester.
Lovely.
So I have a beautiful view to look at. And today it's a gorgeous day with frosty on a blue sky, and the trees, when the sun catches the trees, they're looking golden. So it's fab.
Sounds delightful. Sounds very nice. As I mentioned before, it's slightly different to my drab sky that I'm looking at. It's very grey and very overcast, and there's not really a lot of daylight. But that's the time of the year. You can't expect much more, really. Well, it's great that you got in touch, and you wanted to talk to me initially about you've got a new children's picture book coming out, which is Pandemonium. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Pandemonium, as the title suggests, has something to do with a panda. So the main character here is a purple panda. So the story aims to explore issues around being different and the importance of being yourself. So I have a panda that lives in a department store. And because of her purple colouring, she can get up to all sorts of mischief because she's camouflaged. But when an assistant spots what she's up to, she puts an end to these tricks. And Peter has to think quite clearly about how this affects her and how she can move forward.
Well, it sounds like a great little idea. So where did you come up with the idea in the first place? And what made you decide to write a children's picture book? Because as far as I'm aware, you're actually the first guest that we've had on to talk about this kind of things, which is great. So tell me how it came about.
Well, I am mainly a novelist, so I write adult fiction. But I was teaching a module of writing for children at the University of South Wales. And we were looking at anthropomorphism, where animal characters take on human qualities. And the sort of session was all around that. And we looked at classic examples of how this is done. And then the students went slightly off task and started talking about these cute red pandas that live in China and other places. And suddenly it was like a light bulb moment. I thought, oh, a red panda. Well, if you can have a red panda, why not a purple panda?
Yeah. And so it kind of went from there.
Yeah, that's how it started. But it took a long time to pull all the threads together because obviously it's a picture book, and I had to work very closely with an illustrator. And it took a lot of collaborative work, which I actually really enjoyed because I learned a lot about illustrations through working with Fiona Zechmeister. And she's put the illustrations together, and it's absolutely gorgeous the way she's illustrated the book.
Yeah, I've seen the main cover and stuff, and the artwork looks amazing. So tell us a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of that, because there'll be a lot of people that are listening. They might have even had an idea for a children's book or a children's picture book or whatever, and think, well, they wouldn't know the first place to even get started with that. So how did you go about it? It's one thing having the idea, but how did you actually go about making that, bringing it to fruition?
Well, I'd already had my novel, The String Games, published by Victorina Press. And this is a small press that unusually, it publishes lots of different things. So it publishes non-fiction, fiction, children's books as well. So I thought, well, they'd be the obvious people to go back to. And Fiona was actually the cover designer for The String Games. So I already knew her through that project. I mean, I had some input into the cover of The String Games, so I knew what she was like to work with. So I drafted out the story and put it away, and then came back, did a lot of work on it before I actually submitted it. And then when it was submitted, it was accepted by Victorina Press, and they appointed Fiona to be the illustrator. So then it was a lot of collaborative work with Fiona to move forward to the final draft of the project, and then the printing. Lots of different stages. She had my original text, and then she sort of did some background research. I mean, it was really interesting that she sort of looked at the anatomy of bears before she started off, and then she did sort of little watercolor sketches because she was very keen on getting lots of movement into the illustrations. Then she did thumbnail sketches. Then we kind of matched the words to the thumbnail sketches. And at that point, it was really tricky because the words had to change and then the pictures had to change. And it was all about a negotiation to get the words telling one story and the pictures telling a parallel but more nuanced story.
I see. And in terms of the language there and stuff, obviously, as you said, you were teaching a module, so it's obviously something that you're quite knowledgeable about. But for people that haven't done it before, what sorts of things do you have to keep in mind when you write in this kind of book? What sort of age group is it aimed at?
Well, it's aimed at an interest level. It's aimed 2 to 7-year-olds. That's not the reading level. The reading level
of course,
is quite complicated in this book because I'm very keen on not talking down to children. Using interesting vocabulary is really important to me. Mm-hmm. So it may be difficult for children to decode those words. So toddlers really enjoy this book, but there's something quite magical about the illustrations. But in terms of the writing, it's important to have the language right. So it has to be accessible. But in terms of saying accessible, it's about the rhythm of the words, the pattern of the words, the repetition that you need in a young children's book. So I think those are the keys to getting the language right and then marrying up the pictures with that.
So to a certain extent, there's probably some parallels with poetry, which I know you've had experience of in the past, would you say?
Yes, I mean it's that kind of patterned language that you need so that the words are easy to say, so they're easy to read. And then the repetition are important. So yeah, I mean there are some parallels there. I mean the words actually are quite minimal in this book. It's carried very much by the illustrations. But when you've got few words, they've got to be the right words.
Of course,
so it's very important to sort of hone it down so that you've got the language absolutely right.
Economy's probably really important, which obviously is a massive part of poetry.
Indeed.
And getting it across. So I know, you've written across, you mentioned at the top of the show about your novel, which we'll talk about in a little while as well. But I know you started off, you've written across lots of different formats. You've written short fiction, you've written poetry, and you mentioned the novel as well. But before we get to all of that stuff, tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and your kind of earliest memory of writing.
Well, I was quite unusual, really, because I grew up as a sort of non-reading child. I never saw books as a source of interest and pleasure. I was always given presents of books, and my heart used to sink. When you get a book-shaped present, I'm thinking, I'm never going to read that. I mean, my mum was brilliant because she was still reading to me when I was 13, because I just wouldn't. A book just seemed like really hard work.
Yeah.
I just didn't get this phonic stuff. And I just couldn't, I found it really difficult to decode. Although technically I could read at 11 at a low level, but I just didn't see the pleasure in it at all. It was just all too complicated. So it took a long while to actually read a book for pleasure. It wasn't until I was 17 and I was actually travelling into London for work, and so I had this long train journey, and that's when I thought, well, I might as well read a book. Got nothing else to do unless you want to stare out the window every day. Yeah. So my sister, I had an older sister, and she had been reading The Valley of the Dolls, and so that was the first book I read for pleasure. So it's quite interesting that that's a Virago classic now. But anyway, so I have lots of gaps in my reading history because that's quite a lot of time to make up. But then going into teaching, of course, when I was older in my 30s, I started reading a lot of children's books then and took a lot of pleasure from them as well. And then sharing children's books with my own children. So I did live in a house that had books. My mum was a teacher, and as I said, she read to me for a long, long time. So I still liked hearing stories, but it took a long time to get the confidence to actually read them myself.
Yeah, and at what point, obviously, as you say, you came relatively late to reading, but there must have been something there, whether it was the story or whatever. But what was it that made you think at some point, well, I could do that, or showing an interest in it, especially if you struggled to connect with reading and words and phonics and things from an early age? It's quite unusual, as you say, to a later date to think, right, okay, well, this is actually something I want to have a go at myself. It must have been a bit of must have taken quite a lot of confidence to do that, or at least build up the confidence to do it.
Again, that was much later, and it was kind of another story as well as to how I started writing. Mm-hmm. And that really related to, I lived overseas in my 20s. So at 20, I left my home in London and caught a double-decker bus that went from London to Kathmandu. And this was the start of many travels that I did. And of course, at that time, you just wrote letters, I've got a box file full of all the aerograms that I wrote to my mum back in the day.
Wow,
Had these blue pages, and you
I
licked the
those,
edges to make it into a letter. So I have all these old letters that I wrote to my mum, and really that was the start of enjoying writing, just writing letters. And while I was overseas, from Kathmandu, I went to Australia and worked there for a year. And I actually got married in Australia, and then I went with my first husband to Papua New Guinea, and living in a very isolated and remote location. Beautiful, very, very beautiful, but very far away from anything. So had very little to do. There was obviously no TV. The radio you could barely get because it was in the Highlands. We used to be able to listen to the Voice of America very crackly occasionally. So again, amazingly, there was a tiny library there. So I read all the books in the library, and I, rather than twiddle my thumbs, I wrote letters, and I started writing stories then.
Wow. So yeah, and that you kind of got into there. And do you remember, was there a time when, because as you say, one thing going from writing letters, and I can understand how you kind of fell in love with writing. When do you think the kind of story side of it came out for you? What kind of clicked there? Do you remember? Do you remember the first sort of narrative or story thing that you wrote? Does that stick in your mind?
Well, I played around a lot with different stories over a period, and I went into teaching late. So I became a teacher, and went to university in my late 20s. And as part of the projects that I was working on there, I wrote stories and submitted them as part of my creative profile. So then I got a bit more experience and feedback from that process. And then again, it was a huge jump to after my children were young, when they were sort of teenagers, and I'd been working in education for a number of years. It occurred to me that all my creative energy was going into teaching, and I didn't really have a creative outlet of my own. My husband, for example, was, like gardening as his creative outlook, and other people were painting or cooking, and I didn't really have a creative outlook. And I sort of thought back to the stories that I'd written previously, and I thought, right, this is it. I'm going to really mine this area of creativity and see what I can come out with. And I joined a writing group, and I started writing quite seriously, quite in a dedicated way. I mean, I've put in hours and hours of writing.
Yeah, sure.
I've always taken it quite seriously. Although it started as a hobby, I very quickly decided it was going to be more than that. It was going to be this really route into reaching an audience, sharing my stories. I didn't just want to write for myself. So I was really always aiming at publication. And then in 2010, I had my first story published. So I'd been writing for a couple of years by then. So the first story I had published was by a sort of local project where it was called Broadsheet Stories. And they printed stories on A3 sheets of paper, and they were distributed to cafes around Dorset. I mean, I think it was an Arts Council funded project. But anyway, my story was accepted by Broadsheet Stories, and I was actually paid for it. So I was paid £25. And when I got the cheque, I thought, should I take a photo of this cheque? And I thought, no, I won't bother, because obviously I'll sell more stories. But it was probably about another 2 years before I ever got any money.
So you wish you'd framed it.
Writing again. Yeah, I wish I had. And they also had a website. So my story was up on the website, and it was beside a story by Naomi Alderman. And I was quite chuffed about that.
Yeah. And
And whenever my books are actually in Waterstones, they're often next to hers because our surnames are so close together. So I'm always pleased about that.
Yeah. So I remember back in, I think it was 2018, we actually featured you on like a listener spotlight segment that we were running at the time, and I think you had your short story collection, which was Paisley Shirt. And obviously since then, you've then gone on to write longer stuff, and you mentioned at the top of the show there, you've got so it's your debut novel, The String Games.
Yes, that actually came out last year. So that's been out a year now. So that was fun to write. I actually went back to university. I decided that I wanted to write a novel, and I'd written a lot of short stories. And and to get the sort of, it's really good writing short stories alongside a novel, because it allows you to complete something. With a long project, it's a bit like an endurance task. I run half marathons, and I sort of think there's an analogy there, because it's useful doing short stories and poetry alongside a long piece of work, because they exercise different creative muscles and gives you the sort of stamina to complete this long project.
Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it.
Then I also went back to university and started studying for an MPhil as part of my route to writing a full novel. And then I enjoyed that so much I went on to do a PhD. So the novel itself took a very long time. It was about 6 years to complete. But part of the reason was I was doing all this academic study around it as well.
Yeah, and as you say, you're probably learning your craft from the sounds of it with all this other stuff as well.
My starting point was very low, so I had a lot of ground to make up, and that's why it's been such a kind of long apprenticeship.
Well, why don't you tell us about String Games, since it's out in the world and people may want to check out your novels as well. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the String Games is the story about a young girl. So I've got a young girl protagonist, and she goes on holiday with her family to a campsite in France, and her brother goes missing. And it's really about how she deals with that throughout her growing up period. So it's a 3-part novel. So the first part of the novel is at the time of Joshua going missing. And then we meet her again as a vulnerable teenager as a result of this loss. And then again as an adult of 23, where she's able to go back to the place in France where she last saw her brother and address issues of unresolved grief. So you go through this journey with her. So it's been a well-received book. It was a finalist in the People's Book Prize.
Great.
And in my local area, we have the Dorchester Literary Festival, and it was shortlisted in their writing prize as well. So I think of it as a kind of triptych, if you like, because of these 3 parts. Mm-hmm. And it's unusual to have that actually in books. You often have sort of the juxtaposition of the teenagers and the adult, or the child and the adult. But it's quite unusual to have this 3-part novel. And the closest thing I think I've come to it is actually the film Moonlight. I mean, a completely different context. Yeah. But when I saw that, I thought, oh, my novel and Moonlight say things to each other, because they both start off with the young child and then moving into the teenagers and then the adult. And they've also got this name change in both of them, because my novel starts off with a young girl using a nickname, Nim. And then in order to sort of move forward with her life, she goes back to using her given name, Imogen.
So this kind of, as she matures. So where did the idea come from for the String Games? How did that come about?
Well, it was about missing children, really. I have to confess that when my son was very small, he went missing on a beach in France, and I sort of took that idea and sort of rewrote my own personal history.
That must have been terrifying.
Well, in real life, it all ended well. I mean, I was on holiday with a friend and our children, and I was putting sun cream on my daughter, who was 5, and I just looked up, and my 3-year-old son had gone. You know, it was a busy beach, and I just couldn't see him anywhere.
Yeah.
And it really makes you realise how vulnerable children are when they don't speak the language in another country.
Yeah.
And I was sort of looking around everywhere for him. I couldn't see him. And my friend who spoke French said, don't worry, I'll go to the Lost Children's thing. We'll get an announcement made. And there was a little ping pong on the tannoy, and then this whole spiel in French saying little boy missing, blue trunks, name of Jonathan. And even though I don't understand much French, I understood the woman sitting right beside us in the next family group who said in French, why is it the English always lose their children?
I bet that made you feel great.
Yeah, but after that, I kind of expected somebody was just going to say, he's here.
Yeah.
And nobody did. And then all the sort of beach noises went back again, and he still wasn't around. And I figured the beach was too busy for him to get drowned, so I really was worried about him being abducted. And so I just walked the other way along the beach and just calling his name. And it was, he'd gone a long way, right to the end of the beach, really. And he was just jumping over the waves and completely unaware that, anybody was looking
just
for
kind of
him.
got lost in his own little world, as they
He
do.
was lost in his own little world. So I sort of picked him up and sort of carried him back. And as I was walking back, this man came up to me and he said, is this the missing boy? And I said, yes, thank God I found him. And he said, I went up to him and I said, is your name Jonathan? And he said, no.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my story. But I just kind of slightly wanted to investigate it a bit because I just felt, well, children are so vulnerable. I mean, that was a real wake up call. And I just sort of wanted to explore that a bit more, but not from my own point of view, because obviously I didn't want to relive my own story.
No, I understand that. But at the same time, it is something, as a parent myself, it is something, even when you kind of lose sight of them for a very, very brief period of time when they're small, it is, heart and mouth stuff, isn't it? So it does stay with you. So totally understand.
So that's why I kind of thought there would be a hook there for parents, because, that I think we've all experienced that at one time or another, and just sort of exploring not how that feels as a parent, because we kind of know that, but how that feels for an older sibling and what the implications are for an older child.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that was well received and everything. So what have you got? Are you working on other novels now, or have you got other novels out into the world?
I'm working on a novel that's going to be published in America next year. So I've just almost finished it. I've got to submit by the 1st of January, so I haven't got much time left. But because there's a young boy in the string games, so this he's actually 4 in the string games. I really like playing around with a young boy's voice. Really like that character that I'd written of Joshua, and I thought, well, I wonder if I could write a book with an even younger protagonist. And my writing group says, oh, you'll never sustain that for a whole novel. You can't write from a young boy's perspective all the way through.
And you thought, that sounds like a challenge.
Exactly. Tell me I can't do something. I will give it a go. And so that's what I did. The boy is actually older. I did figure that a 5-year-old voice was actually really challenging to do. So I've got a 7-year-old boy protagonist. And this story is all about, I decided to set it in the time of the sort of Brexit referendum, because I wanted some sort of community tensions going on. So it's set in the suburbs of London at the time of Brexit, and it's all about an intergenerational friendship. So my young protagonist, Huxley, is lonely, and he gravitates towards an old man who's new to the community. And the families in the community are very suspicious of this old man, and probably rightly so, because he is a bit odd. But Huxley can see through all that and sees that there's a genuinely lonely man as well. And can they become friends?
That sounds great. And so that's coming out. So you've got to submit that in January, and then hopefully it's going to be coming out sometime next year, is it?
Yes, in the summer next year.
And how are you getting on? Do you think you're going to make your deadline? Oh, no one's listening. You'll be fine.
I mean, it's just yesterday I thought I had put it to bed and I'd PDF'd it so that I could send it to some other authors who would do an endorsement of it. And then I woke up this morning and I've un-PDF'd it and made some more changes. So I don't know. You've just got to make a decision on when it's actually finished.
At some point, it's like there's a I forget which film director it is, and you can say the same of a novel, but he says a film is never finished; it's only abandoned. And I think it's the same with a book, really, to a certain extent.
Yeah, you've just got to stop it at some point. Otherwise, you just drive yourself mad, sort of tweaking this and tweaking that. So I am going to finish it very soon and send it off.
And then you can relax and you can get stuck into mince pies and all the other stuff that we can do over the festive period.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm planning to have a rest from it, but then I do have another novel on the back burner, so I'll probably get on with that afterwards.
Well, on that subject, so how do you it's clear that you've mentioned before you take it very seriously and you're quite disciplined. So how do you manage to fit writing around real life? How do you manage to fit it in?
Well, I did. I don't work full time anymore, so that obviously frees up a lot of time. So I haven't worked full time for a couple of years. When I was finishing my PhD, and my supervisor said he was going to retire. So I thought, I've got to get cracking and finish this piece of work before he goes. And that meant I cut back on quite a lot of paid work. Now I'm a sort of work as a visiting tutor. So that work is quite intermittent. So my day is like a normal working day, really. And I start writing in the morning it's like a 9 to 5 job. And so I'm, a full-time writer now.
That's good. So you just basically as you say, you treat it as if you're going to the office almost.
Yeah, that's right.
And give us a sense of bit about your approach in general. So for example, let's take the string game. So when you came up with that idea initially, you obviously had the jumping off point and then you developed it. Do you sit down and develop and plan the whole novel, or do you just crack on and start writing some chapters? How does that go?
Well, I didn't with the string games. I didn't plot it at all. I just wrote it, and I would never approach a novel in that way again, because I hate to think how many drafts it went through. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it was 100. I mean, it was a massive amount, and it changed so much, and the structure changed, and the story changed, and I think the only thing that did stay the same was the main protagonist. And it just took so much time. I mean, I learnt a lot from the process, but enough to know I'm never going to do that like that again. So the novel, which is coming out next year, which is called This Much Huxley Knows, was plotted to the nth degree. So I had it absolutely nailed down what was going to happen at every stage. And I did diverge from it at points, but I more or less stuck to it. And then the novel that I'm going to go back to working on, that's in its drafting stage, again, I've plotted that out quite carefully, because I just find if you're writing as you go along, I think for me, I've just wasted so much time. Although they say no writing is ever wasted, because you can recycle stuff. So sometimes bits that get cut get recycled into short stories or other projects that I'm working on.
Yeah, and I can relate to that. I mean, I know from writing the first of my crime novels is the amount of kind of dead ends and not false starts, but going off in strange story directions that then, I can't, see them out, or they end up taking me somewhere I don't really want to be or whatever. And the same as you, I think the amount of time that I've wasted, but then it's probably helped me to find another aspect of the character or taken the story in a different direction that I wasn't maybe considering. So in the big scheme of things, it's probably not time wasted, and you're kind of having to do it. I mean, when you plot something, you're probably still going through that, but it's more you're doing it in your head without writing stuff down as much, I should imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it's when I get to the end of a novel, I look at it and I think, actually, how did I manage that? It's such a intensive piece of work, and it demands so much of the writer. That you get to the end and wonder how you even pulled it off, exactly. It feels amazing.
Yeah. Well, what would you say is your favourite part of the whole thing? And don't say writing the end.
No, I mean, I do like the editing process. I mean, I find I try and get the first draft down as quickly as I can. So when I'm in that stage, I try. I'm amazed at people that can do NaNoWriMo, the National Writing Month, where they're churning out, I think it's 1,600 words a day. Well, I've never managed that. I do 1,000, and that's my limit. So I do 1,000 words a day until I've got a first draft. And then I think the fun starts. I think it's really grueling getting the first draft down.
That's the hardest bit for you. Well, having obviously spent quite a long time doing it now and various different types of writing and whatever, what would you say is the most common mistake that new writers make?
I think I still make it, actually. I think it's about when you think the novel is finished and you've got it to the best shape you possibly can, it's not finished. You still need to go back and do more on it. So, yes, I think it's about working on it until you think it's finished, then putting it away and getting it out again and working on it again, putting it away and then working on it again. So it's about trying to go for continual improvements, really. So don't think it's finished it's not finished when you think it's finished. Go back to it again. How
do you know when it is finished, though?
Well, I think when you can recite it from beginning to end,
word.
It's finished.
When it's really burnt in that much.
Yes.
What would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice that you've been given along the way?
Well, this is certainly something I've taken on board. And I think it's about being generous, and it's about sharing stuff, because otherwise you just drive yourself nuts.
Mm-hmm.
It's about celebrating other people's achievements, because if somebody else can do it, you can do it. And it's about really celebrating how people move on and all their different stages all their different achievements, celebrating other people's successes. I think is really important. Otherwise, you can get a bit embittered, can't you? Why
I agree. Yeah,
me.
Yeah, I agree, and that's part of the reason this podcast exists, for that very reason, to reach out to people and because to be honest, in my experience in publishing and people that write whatever novels or whatever it is, most people genuinely seem to want other people to succeed, and they're good at sharing success and helping each other. But you definitely do see it in some industries, and you do see it with some individuals, obviously, where it's almost this mentality that there's only a set amount of success to go around, or there's only a finite amount of books that can be sold or whatever. And the fact that Gail's book sold X copies means that my book won't sell that amount of copies, and I think that's, as you say, I think that's short-sighted. And the other thing is, it's one of the best ways to learn. You mentioned you're in a writing group, and for me, I would say that was the single biggest evolution in my own writing, was joining a critique group and speaking to other writers and reading my work out and getting their opinions on it, but also me listening to other writers and their work, and me trying to constructively critique it. I learned so much from doing that. I don't know whether you found the same from your writing group.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It is important. You build up those skills. It's much easier to see weaknesses in other people's novels than your own. And when you think, actually, it is an independent task to write a novel, but you do rely on other people as well. So there is collaboration that goes on, which is so valuable. And I've been amazed at how generous people have been when I've come to the point of publishing the novel. For the String Games, I got several authors to read it and endorse it. And it was just a question of emailing them, liking their work and seeing similarities between their work and mine. And then for one Jacqueline Mechard endorsed the String Games. Now, she's a big novelist in America. She's done about 12 novels, and she's very big, and she was on her book was the first book on Oprah's book club. And anyway, so I just decided that I would email her through her website and ask her if she'd have a look at my book. And about an hour later, an email popped in saying, yes, send it over, I'll have a look. And then she gave me a very nice endorsement. So it is about reaching out. I mean, I think writers are very good at reaching out to each other and supporting each other.
Yeah.
So with This Much Huxley Knows, the novel that I'm submitting soon, I was thinking about who I could ask to endorse it. And I decided to email Emma Donoghue. She wrote Room with a 5-year-old narrator. So I emailed her. And although she said she was too busy to do it, she said, always ask, don't be afraid to ask.
Yeah, that's great.
Nothing wrong in asking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and that's, as you say, that's probably a lesson for everybody in general with their writing and getting their work out there in the first place. I think it's how you go about it, isn't it? I think if you just, the very first interaction you have with somebody, you just say, buy my book or whatever, you're obviously not going about it the right way. But I think if you genuinely reach out to people with the right intentions and you try to build relationships, I think that's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, it is about finding other people that are writing similar stuff to you, and offering that encouragement and being a network. Really, I think that's really important. I'm very keen on Twitter. I've met so many people on Twitter that are really supportive, and that's a kind of really a support network, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So if you were starting out again tomorrow as a new writer, what, if anything, would you do differently, or would you go back and tell your younger self?
I think I would have a slight warning. Do you know what you're embarking on, and how long this journey is going to be? But it is worthwhile in the end. I mean, you've got to, if you're aiming for publication, it's a challenge, but it's one that you can embrace, and it's very fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say embrace that challenge, yes.
That's great. And when you were when you first started sending out, say, your first novel, for example, how did you go about that? Were you very targeted? Did you send it out to lots of places? Did you get an agent first, or did you just send it to small publishers? How did that work?
Well, with the string games, initially, I did have an agent. So I entered a competition. It was like a first chapter competition, I think. And I wasn't shortlisted and I didn't win. But one of the judges liked my writing. And so she approached me and offered me representation. So she worked with me on the novel. We did about 3 drafts together. So she edited it and we worked through it. It was a couple of times probably. Mm-hmm. But by that stage, she was pregnant, and I thought, oh, the writing's on the wall here. So she did actually leave. So she took maternity leave and then left the industry. So then I didn't have an agent.
Right.
And by that stage, I was just so desperate. I worked on it for so long. I was just so desperate to get it off my desk. I thought it can take so long to get an agent. I thought, do I really want to do that? And although I approached a few, I didn't really send it out to a lot of people. I just thought, right, I'm going to try independent presses because I thought you'd probably get more sort of one-to-one help with a small press. Uh-huh. And I thought I'd learn more about the whole process of publishing, working with a smaller organisation. So I sent to about 12 independent presses. And at the time, I was thinking I didn't want to go to a press that did print on demand. I wanted somebody that was going to invest in a print run. Mm-hmm. And a couple of people came back. One was a print run, so I didn't want that. Another said they couldn't publish it for about 2 years. And I thought, I can't wait another 2 years. Yeah. And then Victorina Press offered me a contract. So that's why I decided to go with them, because they did a print run and they could publish it within a year.
And so your mind was made up and off you went.
Yes, indeed. So that was that.
That's good. And how have you found the whole experience?
Well, again, I've learnt a lot. I've really enjoyed the process. I mean, I really, getting published is great, of course, because Victorina Press gave me a really nice product that I'm very proud of. The cover's beautiful. The typesetting's great. I mean, the book is lovely. You know, it's nice to have that book in your hands. So that's all very good. It's nice to have a bit of recognition through the competitions, and the publisher was very good at entering my book for lots of different competitions. And it's nice to have a readership, you know, people telling you, giving you reviews, giving you feedback. So that's all been good. But I suppose with everything, you're come to a stage now where I'm thinking of the next thing and the next thing. I'm always looking at the next project. So that can be really exciting.
Absolutely. Well, you've kind of hinted at it, so you've sort of told us. So just remind us of when the next book's coming out, and also tell us where people can find out more about you online.
Well, I have a blog, which is gailaldwin.com. I'm also on Twitter with a Twitter handle at Gail Aldwin, so I'd be very pleased to engage with anybody on social media or through my blog. My next novel is called This Much Huxley Knows, and it will be released in July 2021.
Brilliant. Well, it's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you, Gail, but for the time being, thanks for coming on Joined Up Writing.
Thank you so much.
Joined Up Writing.
There you go. Thanks again to Gail Aldwin, whose book Pandemonium is available right now as the perfect last-minute gift for the kids in your life, or go and check out her other work online. And I'll put all of those links in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That pretty much wraps it up for this week, other than the sneak album preview I promised at the top of the show, and I'll play that after I've done the sign-off. But don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you want to get your podcasts from, and then you can have the podcast downloaded automatically every time. Also remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts, because it really does help others to find the show, or recommend it to one of your friends, family or enemies. So this week is the opening track of the album. It's called Nighttime of the Soul and was written at 4 a.m. in a lonely London hotel room, but I'll save that story for maybe the next episode. A reminder of the band name, which is the Rye Dogs, W-R-Y that is. And the album is called Are You Even Listening, which, is a worthy question most weeks on this podcast. But it'll be available before Christmas on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and on CD. So as always, feel free to let me know what you think about it.
There's a place in town I secretly frequent when I'm feeling down and wish why the leaves been spent. There's no sign on the window, but when the time is right you'll still go to the place called the nighttime of the soul. Hats off to the gentleman at the bar. With his lack of style and grace he'll not get far. So he drowns himself in lager to forget that he's a father in the place called the nighttime of the soul. Sweeping up is a girl I used to know. She doesn't have a brush but doesn't seem to know. So she shuffles round the tables, reciting Aesop's fables in the place called the nighttime of the soul. I hear a ticking sound inside my head. Should ignore when your hopes and dreams are littered upon the floor. So when you hear me scream and shout, well, I suggest you to get out of the place called the nighttime of the soul. The place called the nighttime of the soul. The place called the nighttime of the soul.
There you have it. Thanks for listening, hopefully. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.